So, welcome to another interview of Humans of Gestalt. I'm Chantal Wiley, and I'm a Gestalt organization development practitioner and coach. And I'm a South African, and I'm here with another South African, and it's my absolute pleasure to conduct this interview. Over to you.
I'm Paul Morris, also South African, but a kind of introduced species because I wasn't born in South Africa, and I'm also a Gestalt trained therapist and coach.
And where are you at the moment, Paul?
I'm sitting in my study. Actually, it's my wife's study because she's got it, Jen's study. She's got it set up better than me because I don't normally work at a desk very much. I'm a bit of a nomad in the sense of I think I don't like feeling chained to a desk. So if I work, I move around, and I'm looking out over a beautiful spring Cape Town garden.
Lovely, lovely. I like this bit about not being chained to a desk. Um, and maybe you could bring it into my next question, which is you're a Gestalt therapist, you're a Gestalt coach, but who are you as a human being? Like, how do you conduct yourself in the world, including not being chained to desks?
It's quite a difficult question because I always think like the instinct is to answer sort of what I am, and I think that might be different to who I am. But when I think of who I am, I find it hard to separate it from what I am. I'm sure there's a difference. So, we, who am I? I'm a. Hmm. I think I've probably been different things. So I guess I'm probably right now. I am a person who's excited about some new ventures. I'll say new, but going back to my Gestalt therapy. So there's I'm an excited person, I suppose, is more of a who than a what. The what is, what I do and what I've been and how I consider myself. I'm a white heterosexual middle-aged 50-something man in a context where I guess we've got a lot to answer for as a generation in South Africa. I suppose that's veering more into the what, but it's something that is probably talks to who I am as well. The person that I am has been perhaps reconciling who I am with what I've done in the past, which we can get round to as a white South African, as a white South African male of a particular generation, and we can get into the perhaps details of that, of being a conscript in the South African army and everything, but just sort of a generation that grew up during the back end of apartheid, possibly through some of the worst years of apartheid in the 70s and 80s, and trying to, over the years, work out what that means for me as a person who believes in social justice and you know, respecting the humanity in everybody.
So let's talk about that, Paul. Let's talk about um, so what you've just said. You're not what people might think the stereotypical white South African of your gender and age is. What you've just said speaks to a very deep process that you have gone through since being a conscript in the apartheid army. Would you say more about that, the events and the circumstances that shaped your life?
Yeah, so I think it's been a whole, I think it's a lifelong process in a sense. So I mean, I always think like as children, and I don't think just obviously not just male children, but speaking from my experience as a man, as a boy, we were effectively groomed for our futures. So, groomed as being an integral part of this patriarchal system, groomed to be soldiers effectively. So, think about the strict uniform codes, the quite, to be honest, brutal corporal punishment that we got right from primary school age right through to high school. We were basically being groomed to be a certain narrow kind of man. The system had quite a narrow view of masculinity and what it means to be a man. And I suppose for a long period of my formative years and earlier adulthood, I was, I suppose, struggling to reconcile who I am, more sensitive, more tuned into people, an inquiring mind, critical thinking, which I think has always been part of who I am. Trying to reconcile that with this narrow view of men being tough, being quite emotionally restricted by our upbringings, so that certain emotions were unacceptable. Our more sensitive emotions and sides being closed down, and trying to reconcile that with that not being me. And of course, everything was leading us, to be an effective soldier. You don't want to be questioning and critical, and to be part of the broader system of apartheid South Africa. You needed to fit in and fit into quite an authoritarian system where it was quite very hierarchical, and you did as you were told, and you didn't question too much. So I suppose, that without realizing it, there was that constant tension in a way going on with me. And over the years following my military experience and going through a more broad-minded education at university, once I got to university, and I started being able to understand the context I was in and what that meant for me, and being able to, I think I always kind of rejected it, but didn't really have the facts or the skills to understand what I needed to question, because anyone who grew up in the apartheid sort of system knows how closed it was, and you really had to work hard to get the alternative ideas about everything, about what the future could look like, what a proper democracy might look like, as opposed to this sort of phony democracy that we were being sold as a future, how gender relationships might work differently, and all those sorts of things. So I started to understand myself much better when I was able to read more widely and get access to more ideas. And so I suppose I kind of moved into my adulthood, beyond university, with a much deeper understanding, not only of the system in South Africa, but of myself as a result.
Mm-hmm. So maybe for some of the people watching this that may not understand kind of the scale of things in South Africa, I'm thinking it might be useful to say that out of, say, in the 1980s, 50 million South Africans, maybe 3 or 4 were white South Africans. It's something like that. Yeah. So the country was economically, politically functioning to the benefit of those 3 or 4 million people, and basically extracting resources, labor, etc., from the others who had no political rights or economic rights most of the time. So Paul, given what you've just said, when and how did you discover Gestalt, and what did that bring you in this sort of evolution or development of your thinking?
So it's quite interesting. So Jen was doing a course at a master's course at university in the UK. I can't remember which one, and it was in personal and organizational change. It's the space that she works in, and she brought home a book, a pile of books. It was a module she was doing on counseling and therapy models. So she had this pile of books. Everyone was a different model, from person-centered to oh my goodness, I can't. I'm gone blank on all the different models. But anyway, in the middle of all that was Gestalt, was a book on Gestalt, and I read most of those books. In fact, I probably read all of those books. At the time, I was working as a human resources manager and wondering how to get out of corporate. Again, it was something that didn't really fit with who I am. Working in the corporate space for various reasons. So I was looking for something else, and coaching was something I was interested in. It was sort of early 2000s, and I think the coaching courses that I'd looked at seemed quite lightweight and superficial at the time for what I was looking for. And so when I came across these books on therapy models, I thought, actually, this is deeper and richer and more interesting and more fundamental for me at that time in terms of what I wanted to know about change in people. And so the Gestalt model just really jumped out at me and gave me a big hug. It was like, oh my word, this is just fits with me perfectly. It's not analytical. It's not putting people into boxes. It's not talking about relationships in very sort of transactional ways. This is something that's much more organic, obviously influenced by Zen, Buddhism, and other traditions. And I just thought, wow, this is, for some reason, everything that I read, even in that little, that brief sort of introduction book, I just thought this is something that I want to know more about. And then, funny story, because so Jen, there was this one of the course people, I think, was a guy called Paul Barber, who I know he's taught at Metanoia, and he's a therapist and he's done consulting, but he was running a regular weekend workshop. And so I thought I'd go to that, having never sat in a process group in my life, having never been in therapy in my life, and not knowing what a workshop was in the context of Gestalt, and it terrified the life out of me. And to make things more difficult, Jen had come along. Well, we both gone together. She was going and said, "Why don't you come along?" Which I just think, as a sort of introduction to this sort of fairly scary environment in this group full of people who are quite aware of how to be in groups and how they are in groups and being quite courageous in what they were saying and doing. And there's me, like terrified because this is just a completely alien environment and people are interacting in such a way, in a way that I'd never experienced before. None of the social niceties and politeness, although it was very respectful, etc. But so at the end of the day, I said, I could manage this if I was here on my own, but there was something about managing the dynamics of myself and the group and myself and my partner all in the same space. At that time, it was just too much. It was just too much for me in my sort of inexperience and my journey of sort of evolving awareness. So I bailed out and didn't go back the second day. And had all sorts of reactions and responses to that. It kicked up all sorts of things. And of course, obviously over once I got into my own training, there were other terrifying groups, but but I was able to, learn about myself in the groups and gradually become a little bit more comfortable. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a while ago when you talked about your experience in the army. I'd like us to have time to talk about that because you've written your extraordinary book about this experience. And I think what was so outstanding for me about this book, unlike, people going back and writing about something that happened to me 20 years ago, you had almost this dialogue in the book between what had happened to you in the 1980s and your experience of going back to the same places, sometimes talking to some of the people involved in the moment. It was, for me, an extraordinary dialogue between the past, which was important to record and draw on, and your present experience, which is very Gestalt. Say a little bit about that book and your process of writing it and what's come out of it in the work that you do today.
So, I mean, there's a lot there, and I was thinking about it this morning when I was out walking, thinking about what this that journey means to me now. Because of course, I stand by everything I wrote in the book, but the thoughts and ideas and feelings have also changed over time. I mean, first of all, I would never have been able to write the book in the way that I wrote it without having spent 5 years training in Gestalt. My therapy training was really based. A lot of it was very heavily based on my own exploration of myself. So a lot of time in personal development groups, 4 years in therapy as a compulsory part of my training. So sitting in groups mainly. So I was able to voice what I was feeling in the moment and gradually just become more comfortable with saying, okay, this is me, this is what I think and what I feel right now. And you can disagree and you can feel something different, and that's okay. And so that's sort of putting it quite simply, but that ability to just say what was going on for me and be okay with that enabled me to write this book where I could just put down what the experiences were like and how I think about the experiences now. So the journey was quite extraordinary, and I never expected it to turn out the way it did. So I thought I kind of accidentally dealt with some of my wartime experiences in therapy. I didn't think it had bothered me until it popped up in therapy, and it turned out there was something going on which was related to the war, and my experience in the war that I didn't realize was related to the war. So it kind of said something to me about the nature of post-traumatic stress responses, that actually we don't always know that it's directly linked to the event.
Mm.
It seems obvious now, but I guess so. I was 20 when I was fighting in Angola. So I'd come pretty much straight from school, straight into uniform, into a war, and then out onto the street. I'd never experienced myself really as an adult outside of school for any length of time to really know anything about myself. So you get this extraordinary experience of being on a battlefield, which is really it's not a normal place. The modern battlefield is not a place we evolved to be, I guess, as human beings. It's just not. It's just totally off the charts in terms of what the human being goes through. Then you come out of that experience newly really into society as a man, in our case, because we were all men in the SADF. And so anything that happens after that, you've got nothing to measure it against. You don't know that this is not normal to be out, drinking heavily, binge drinking heavily. For example, I had friends that were in bar brawls. I mean, and these are people who have now moved through it and they've come out. Some of them are very, good jobs and fairly balanced lives. But at the time, they were fighting in bars and taking out all this anger and rage and post-war response in that way. So to get back to me, the experience in therapy, I thought I'd worked through some residual. And then when I was living in London at the time when I was doing my training, moved back to South Africa, and I had some time. So I thought this is a good time to go back to Angola. Because, of course, Angola had still been involved in a civil war up until 2002, even though I came out of the bush in 1987. The war had carried on. There'd been a brief moment of peace in the 90s, and then the war carried on. So there'd been no opportunity to go back before for me. So I went back about 2012 or 11, something around there. And I went back with a former MK commander, Mkhonto Wisizwe, the South African Liberation Movement, the military wing of the ANC. And he invited me to go with him, and he would take me to Cuito Carnival, which is the site of many big battles towards the end of the war. And I was involved in fighting south of there. And my plan was to cycle alone through Angola and back to my old base in northern Namibia. So the whole journey was about 3 weeks. The almost in the first day or second day of being back in Angola or back at Quito Carnival, where I started my journey in Angola on the bicycle, I realized that there were leftovers that I didn't know were there. And I sat next to a Cuban who was similar age to me at the time, in my mid-40s. And I didn't speak any Spanish, he didn't speak any English. And we worked out through writing dates in the sand and miming, shooting rifles and stuff, that we'd both been in that area at the same time during the war. He'd been there for 3 years, and I was there for 3 months in total. So I was literally talking to the enemy, inverted commas. And we had this interaction, which I think is probably one of the most profound meetings I've ever had with another person, with no common language at all. Just looking into each other's eyes. I just arrived back there. He was working there, building in the new airport at Quito Carnival. So he'd come back himself. So he'd gone back to Cuba as a young man and come back as a contractor. And so I could see that he understood the emotions I was feeling being back in Angola in this battlefield. And I think I could see that he'd been through something similar when he'd come back. So there was this connection. And the only word I knew in Portuguese, obviously what they speak in Angola, to kind of try and say something vaguely in the right direction in terms of what I was feeling was I'm sorry. And he was like, no, there's nothing to be sorry about. But I was kind of feeling, it was more like, I'm sorry that I've fought in this war. I'm sorry that I was involved in killing other human beings, and I'm sorry that the world is set up that we can now sit here and have a beer and talk about it. But 25 years ago, if we'd have met, one of us would have died. And that's what I'm sorry about. And that set, I'm going to keep talking, but you're welcome to interrupt.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So that was before I even started my journey. And when I got on my bicycle a day or so later and to cycle alone and unsupported, I started thinking like, geez, I wish I'd have met this guy right at the end, because it felt like that should have been the climax of my trip. But as the days went by, I realized, no, it was good that I met him in the beginning. It was almost like a Gestalt experiment. You don't know what's going to happen. You set something up with a client or with a group, and no one knows what's going to happen. You might have a theory, and then suddenly all sorts of things come out. I mean, I wept like a child in the Land Rover going back from this party back to where we were staying for the night. I mean, and I didn't quite understand what it was about. It was like this massive release of emotion. And then I realized, because I've got a lot more left over from this war than I thought I had. I thought I dealt with it. And so the 3 weeks on the bicycle traveling through Angola was like a processing period for me, processing what was left. And the first, I don't know, week maybe, there was a lot of battlefield reminders, or a lot of burnt out tanks and armored personnel carriers along the side of the road. There were minefields all over Angola still at that time. And so the war reminders were there, and I was sleeping in the bush as I was as a soldier. And so there were so many parallel journeys going on. But there was something around gradually moving away from the worst of the war zone into places where there were less reminders, and then gradually tuning into what was there now. So there were less tanks and stuff burnt out on the side of the road. And I started to enjoy the forests, because they've got beautiful forests. Enjoyed just greeting everybody. On a bicycle, you greet absolutely everybody on the side of the road. Some days I'd be hoarse just from saying good morning, good afternoon. So I kind of brought Angola into the present. I'd moved from the past along this road of war. The road between Quito and Monongi was called, they used to call it the Road of Death, because it was a supply route that was constantly being bombed by UNITA, the rebels, and the South African Defence Force.
Mm.
So just this feeling of death and gradually opening up and seeing Angola. So by the time I got probably halfway through the journey, I was just enjoying traveling in this amazing country and seeing these amazing people. So I brought Angola from the past very much into the present.
Mm. I've heard you talk about your book, and I've read the book. For people who are listening, it's called Back to Angola. Um, and I'm just really moved in hearing you talk about it today, because I'm thinking about the sort of seemingly intractable conflicts that are going on in the world as we speak, especially in the Middle East, in Ukraine. Um, and, that's what it felt like in South Africa in the 1980s. And through the kind of reconciliation work of people like yourself, there's big reconciliation work that happened in our Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then there's just the person to person interactions, the I'm sorry's, they're the shared experiences that have created moments of kind of healing, if you like. So I'm listening to you today, Paul, with also a sense of hope for the conflicts that are happening in the world. And yeah, one of the recollections I have was once being at your house, and one of the Namibian guys was there, who had been fighting on the other side, and you were standing around the braai with your friends. And I don't see you as a major, like, or sort of a military person, but you were discussing mortars and the arc and reach of mortars and your mortars, and I was absolutely astounded, because actually what was happening in front of me was just some guys who were on both sides of a fairly awful situation, just being human with one another. And that made a huge impression on me.
Mm. So that was Chris, who I met at the end of my bike journey in northern Namibia. He'd been a commander with PLAN, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, and he'd done special forces training in Cuba and Eastern Europe, and I think Eastern Europe. But it's interesting. So I've found that I met quite a few former combatants. So Patrick, who passed away about a year ago, who took me to Angola, was the first one. Our mutual friend Chanil, I think you introduced me. I think he was the first one. Then Patrick, and then I met Chris, and I met a woman by accident right up in the north of Namibia. She was now a police commissioner in the Namibian police, doing a border inspection, and she'd been at Kasinga, as I think she was 15 or something at Kasinga, and had survived. This was a big attack that the South African paratroopers did on a base in southern Angola, which was a transit camp for basically refugees coming out of Namibia, volunteers for the liberation movement, etc. And there was a huge massacre, and most of them weren't combatants.
Yeah.
So and all of them, we had very human connections. There was no talk of the ideologies, or just really just people wanting to connect as people first. When I met, I don't remember what her name was now, I think it was Matilda. When I met her, it was at a little it was a guest house that they'd made out of a former SADF base up in the north of Namibia. It was like in the ammo dump, I think, that they built this lovely guest house and museum to the war. And they were watching documentaries on Kasinga and other things, and she was pointing out people she knew. But just having conversations with her, and she was like, "It's over. You were a conscript. You had no, you had no choice." I kind of disagree with that, because there were choices, but the choices just didn't seem like choices at the time for me. So it would have been leaving the country, and probably at that time not knowing if you'd ever be able to go back. But just that this huge generosity of spirit that these, people who fought for their liberation and their people's liberation, and who I'd been fighting against, effectively fighting for oppression, fighting on the wrong side of history. And it would have just been very easy for them and very understandable for them to say, I don't really want to talk to you. You caused so much pain and suffering, and for decades, and well, go back centuries if you want, legitimately go back centuries of oppression. And I one of the American writers who did, I think they were psychiatrists, was Jonathan Shea and Edward Tick. I'm going to get it wrong, but I think it was Jonathan Shea wrote about something called moral injury. And because he said he worked a lot with Vietnam vets. And he was saying he was seeing something that didn't conform to his idea of what post-traumatic stress disorder should look like. He said there was something else going on. And I didn't know what. And he eventually came to this concept of moral injury, which he says is and I'd have to go back and read to get it exactly right, but something like the orders that soldiers were getting on the battlefields went against deeply held moral beliefs. So maybe burning villages or killing civilians, or things that deeply wounded them on a moral level. And that really resonated with me because I didn't feel, for various reasons, I didn't have all the things that you would say would make up post-traumatic stress disorder, but there was something like sort of a slow poison in the system that just I never really felt right. Always, I was thinking about the war all the time. And when I heard that concept, I thought, this is it. This is not exactly what Jonathan Shea was talking about, but I fought for an illegitimate system, a system that wasn't a moral system, a system of oppression. And there was something, I think, for me, something like who am I? I realized this system deeply offended, fighting with the system deeply offended me on a deeply moral level. Apart from the terrible experiences on a battlefield, this was something else that was going on. And having these meetings with former combatants, part of the healing was this kind of being able to, meet the enemy on a human level and say, I see you as a person and you're seeing me as a person and we're okay, And that was, for me, that was the healing that needed to happen, that I didn't realize before I set out on my bicycle down the dusty roads of Angola.
So, Paul, one of the things that I know about you is that you, for your Gestalt studies, you wrote a piece on presence. I think it was a thesis on presence. And if you think about these experiences that you had with these men who were fighting on the other side, and some of your friends who fought on your side, also probably with moral injury, and about you went in to do some work with people who were suffering from the results of this war, including, as you mentioned, our friend Shanil Haricharan, who is also a Gestalt trained person, who was at huge personal risk, smuggling weapons, etc., etc. And I think in his work with you, started to realize what he was carrying. And he did that publicly. So I'm just I'm saying that as a public statement. What did you draw on from Gestalt theory and practice, especially around presence, how you hold yourself as a white South African man, in the context of this work with this society that was suffering from this sort of psychological legacy of the past? What in Gestalt did you draw on?
It's hard because I think a lot of what I've learned through my training is so integrated. It's hard to know, what's what I'm drawing on in terms of theory and what it's just become who I am. I think there's something around authenticity and honesty, and I think you can only certain kinds of work. I mean, there's no set formula, but I think for me, having understood where I am with my experiences, but from a from everything from sort of my politics to my understanding of history to my deeply held beliefs, and also just to my emotional responses and being more tuned into, rather than reacting, but being more tuned into to where I am emotionally in relation to some of these, meetings and things. And I think I suppose that draws on on presence really. So it's on the theories of presence. So I mean, a lot of what we have out in the world is people shouting at each other, and without really maybe owning their own anger or their own fear, or
Yeah.
and so it's all out there, which of course is really sort of amplified by social media, because you're just kind of, rather than having to look inwards and go, okay, what's going on here for me, you're looking outwards going, okay, there's someone else shouting the same stuff, I must be, it must be right. Look, I see it with a lot of the conflicts going on and people taking sides and some of the stuff that people put up on social media. And I think if you got people sitting down in a room together, probably going to get quite a different response. Not always. I think if some conflicts just seem to have gone too far at the moment. There seems to be a lot of work needs to be done to get people sitting down. But I think, in my experience, when people get in a room together and talk one to one, tends to be way more respectful.
Mm-hmm.
And people tend to see the other person as a person, more of a person than as an object. I even think of the likes of Chris, the Namibian freedom fighter. I know he's met lots of former SADF guys, and he's met a lot of them who don't hold the views I hold.
Yeah.
And they probably still believe that they were doing the right thing because they were fighting communism or however they conceptualize it. But when they meet Chris, there's something else happens. So the ideology becomes less important than the meeting of the individuals. And what I've seen is a lot more respect than I would have expected, given the rhetoric out on the internet and the places, the echo chambers. Yeah.
Yeah, and as you say, when people meet in the same place, and especially when they share, as you said, their anger or their fear and own it, then we can start to meet. Yeah. So say a little bit about how this experience how you've taken this into your current practice. You coach in South African organizations these days where the battle lines are not drawn, but there's certainly conflict and projections and stereotyping and that happen in these teams of diverse people in a country where there have been oppressors and oppressed. All the psychological legacy is bouncing around the boardroom table. You and I coach in this environment. What is supportive from Gestalt as you work not only with diversity, but with diversity that has often a lot of pain involved in it?
So my work's moved much more into the therapeutic space at the moment, and obviously my work isn't as much in groups; it's more individuals. But the thing with my work in Gestalt, working in a Gestalt way, is that it's working with what's in the room now. So you don't want people talking about too much. You want to, okay, that's fine to contextualize where you are, but bring it back to right here. What's happening right here? I mean, I'm so I'm a white 50-something man. If I'm sitting down with someone from a different background, sometimes it's important just to acknowledge what's in the room as a practitioner, because I come with all this historical baggage, and so what does that mean for my client sitting with me? And not just the political stuff, but just as a man, if I'm working with a woman client, just to, if it's relevant, what do I, what's going on here between us? What are you aware of? As I say, if that's the way the conversation is going, sometimes you can hear people talking, your client talking about, and you realize there's something actually going on between. And so you're bringing it into the now, into the present. So I think it goes for any of the conflicts. So it's easy. People will argue about what's happening out there, and really what they're doing on another level is trying to express something about what's happening here and now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Speaking, for example, in generalizations or projections around their situation rather than speaking from the I. Yeah. Anything else? I think it's important, and in a way, it's a responsibility for us white South Africans, Paul, to really to know what happens with other people in our presence, talking about presence. And you've just said a little bit now about it, yeah, where you can pick it up. This is about something. It's not what's happening here. But say a little bit more about how you hold yourself and conduct yourself and make contact with the diversity and history around you in the world. Because I think those of us who've had Gestalt training, we work with a lot of awareness around this, and it may be useful, given the South African situation, for us to say something about it. How do you hold yourself? What in Gestalt theory supports you in that?
I think it's difficult. I mean, I find it difficult. It difficult because of our history. It's not simple. I don't think there's an easy way to be with it. I think, and quite rightly, whether it's being, a white South African or a male in the world, man.
Yeah.
There's that I have a sort of I don't know, structural set of privileges, I guess, white male, particularly in South Africa, coming from a particular generation, that I've been supported by this structure of privilege. And there was that academic from Rhodes University that wrote about, whites should just shut up. And I'm not necessarily a believer in that, because I think there needs to be dialogue, in a Gestalt sense. We need to talk authentically and listen deeply and respond. But I think perhaps there is something, I can try and be clever about, how I think I should be in the world in relation to this, but maybe listening is the most important thing. And rather than responding too quickly to, I'm full of ideas. I like to I like to share my ideas, and I like to test them against other people and hear their responses, and that's just who I am. But sometimes you need to shut up and just listen and feel how I respond to what's going on out there, and try and reflect on what's being said out in the world, rather than always feeling the need to, that I need to contribute something. Because sometimes the best contribution is just to really listen very deeply.
Yeah. There's something very profound about that. I'm just sitting with it for a moment, listening really deeply to our fellow South Africans. Yeah. Just out of interest, because you and I can see we've liked talking about books in this interview, and people that have books that have impressed us. Or last year, or maybe earlier this year, a person who I deeply respect as a historian has written a book called Ordinary Whites. His name is Neil Roos. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at Fort Hare, which is one of the sort of traditional kind of iconic African universities, sort of centers of African thought. And he's a white South African. And his intention with this book was to write the story of how ordinary whites were actually controlled and manipulated under apartheid, which is what this interview, what you started talking about. And this book has been widely and positively received as a part of the story of apartheid that has not been written. So I'm just thinking about what you said about dialogue, that our voices need to be heard, but we need to be really nuanced and aware and careful and respectful about when and how much we say and how much airtime we take up.
I definitely I agree with that. Yeah. I think I think, I find I'm constantly trying to negotiate these ideas, and because it's quite a censorious time. I mean, there are elements on the left that will close down dialogue because the speakers are not saying things in the right way. Even allies who don't use the correct language or get the concept, don't align with the concepts quite well, or the ideology or whatever, they get closed down, on social media in particular. I'm not sure how this plays out. I mean, I'm not on campuses, and I don't know how this plays out in terms of face-to-face conversation. It seems like that can also happen. Speakers being denied. I'm not sort of one of those with bashing the idea of cancel culture and stuff, but I do think there's pile-ons. People just try and all have a go at somebody, and without really listening or responding respectfully and in depth.
Yeah.
The sort of the conversation becomes quite superficial when it goes online often.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you've just said, it's about listening really deeply, and being curious. I think somewhere you talked about curiosity as well. Mm-hmm. Paul, I have a last question. Where is Gestalt as a body of theory, practice, body of knowledge? In your opinion, where is Gestalt going? What's the relevance of Gestalt in today's world? Because we do stand for dialogue and deep listening, and the world is made up of one-liners on X, Twitter, whatever. So, what's the place of Gestalt?
Sure. And I'm not really in the center of the Gestalt world in that sense. I just do my work. But I was interested in something. I watched a previous interview on Humans of Gestalt with David Mann. And David Mann, just David Mann, yeah. And and he was saying I think they were talking maybe more about the UK and Gestalt in the UK. And there's obviously you're fighting for a lot of space with other modalities that are more in vogue because they may be measurable, and government departments love being able to measure, whereas Gestalt's more difficult. And he was like, well, maybe we're trying too hard to fit in. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. You can go back and look at his interview, but something like that. Maybe we're trying too hard to fit in. And Gestalt's always been a rebel movement. It started as a rebel movement, going against the orthodoxy, and maybe Gestalt needs to stay tuned into this the creativity of Gestalt, the experimentation of Gestalt, trying to look at client work, organizations, political situations from a more rebel standpoint, not trying to see. One of the things Paul Barber writes about in his book on organizational consulting is you got to hold up the mirror to the organization and say, this is what is here, not what you think is going on. This is so we investigate and show what is. And I think perhaps in all aspects, in Gestalt's sort of interaction with the system, in inverted commas, or with clients, our role is to facilitate an inquiry what is in the moment, in the present, what's happening right now, and everything changes from moment to moment, and I think that for me that gave me encouragement as well in my sort of practice at the moment, is that I must just do what try and stay closer to the roots of Gestalt, which is focusing on what's best for my client, and staying with experimentation and creativity, and kind of to hell what the system says.
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, and just to experiment creatively with something different and see what happens. Yeah, yeah. As we conclude, and with your remarks, I'm thinking about I had the experience to go on a walking tour of areas of Berlin that related to Fritz and Laura Perls' time here. And I learned something that I never knew, that the Perls actually left Germany in 1933, not because they were Jewish. It was because they were anti-fascist. And they were part of an anti-fascist organization. And in the last month before they left Germany, Laura Pearl said in an interview that they slept in a different house every night because the police were after them. So and the reason why they left South Africa after they came to Johannesburg and were here until 1947 was they didn't like the rise in fascism. So there's something very unorthodox. We don't want to be controlled. We want to, this little bit, we want to be creative. We want to be in the moment. We want to be what is, not with what is imposed from outside, is at the heart of the beginnings of Gestalt thinking. So, yeah, that was something new for me to understand this really strong anti-fascist stance.
And I think there's a clue in there to looking at the world today from the perspective of Gestalt, is to try and understand what it is we're seeing. And I don't think our media necessarily reflects what we're seeing. So, if you think about the rise of the riots across different parts of Europe and the United States, you've got to look at where that comes from and try and understand with some compassion and empathy, as difficult as it might be, as if you were looking at a client. I mean, I've had some quite frightening clients who I wouldn't ever connect with outside of the therapy room because they're frightening people. But once I got to understand them, they were less frightening and more understandable. And I think there are things going on in the system that are promoting this rise of fascism that on people, more progressive people don't spend enough time acknowledging and trying to work out how do we pressure the system to take some of these things into account.
Yeah. And instead of just dismissing, deeply listening, trying to understand so that dialogue can begin. Paul, is there any last thought that you would like to leave us with in this interview of yourself as a human being in Gestalt?
Probably as soon as I hang up, I'll go, oh, hang on. But you can't have regrets, right? You just got to stay in the moment. No, I think that it's been really, really stimulating and fun to talk about. Talk about how life just can be looked at through the Gestalt lens, and how it does help me to understand my place in the world.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.